Yes, this is my third and a half video about the science and politics of sex. So far in this series, I've succeeded in getting everyone to hate me. I've pissed off the people who say sex is not binary by showing that, according to biology, it technically is. But I've really pissed off the folks who say sex is binary because I call bullshit on whatever they say next about politics and culture. You see, in the field of biology, sex is defined very narrowly as gamete production. Males can produce sperm, females can produce eggs. Those are the only two options, hence binary. Well, that's the elevator definition anyway. There's a bit more when you get into hermaphroditic species or sexing sterile individuals based on potential gamete production, but still, that is all that term means, just gamete production. It does not encompass hormone levels or chromosomes or muscle mass, not even genitals. Those things are not gametes, and FYI, they're also not binary. My point is, if you use that narrow definition of sex as binary, fine, but you can't have your cake and eat it too and claim that somehow justifies your opinions about gender roles or bathrooms or sports teams, because it doesn't. Gametes are completely irrelevant to all of that, and they certainly don't justify any sort of discrimination or bigotry or segregation. In short, I am pro-science and pro-humanity, which, last time I checked, includes all people, regardless of their sex or gender identity. So today I'll be critiquing Richard Dawkins on this subject, the science he gets right, and the, stuff he says next. So let's dive right in with no interruptions this time. Seriously? Not again. Just hang on, okay? One sec. Anyway, in the last episode, I explained why Colin Wright is right that gametes are binary, but wrong to argue from that about sports and bathrooms and prisons, because again, totally irrelevant. As one commenter put it, thanks so much for this, he's one of the most authoritative anti-trans pseudo-intellectuals out there at the moment. And thank you for that comment at Utilities9413. I don't know if I'd go quite as far as calling Colin a full-blown pseudo-intellectual like Jordan Peterson, but you know, the two of them have both been featured on PragerU now, so I don't know, maybe watch that space. And yes, that's the PragerU, the fake university dedicated to anti-science propaganda who, among other things, opposed the theory of evolution, aka Colin's entire profession, and they especially oppose his colleague and personal hero, Richard Dawkins. But the enemy of Colin's friend is a platform opportunity, I guess. I don't think that's how that phrase usually goes. Wait, try again. Colin Wright loves Richard Dawkins. PragerU hates Richard Dawkins, so Colin likes Prager... That still doesn't make sense. Anyway, throwing him under the bus notwithstanding, Dawkins is Colin's personal hero, and I know that because he said so.
I want you to all get up and help me introduce Richard Dawkins. It is my great honor, and I'm sure he's your hero as well as mine. Please, everybody, get up.
Well, yes and no. Tell you what, instead of Colin's fanboy introduction of Richard Dawkins, here's a little intro of my own, and it's okay, you don't have to stand for this part. On the positive side, Colin's hero is an award-winning scientist, author, professor, lecturer, and philosopher. Dawkins has always been a controversial figure, initially because he was so outspoken against religion. He was famously dubbed as one of the four horsemen of new atheism. It's not quite so new these days, but Dawkins in his day ruffled a lot of feathers by calling religion a mind virus.
That's a mind virus. I think religion belongs in that category. Religious ideas belong in that category, and well-organized religions like Roman Catholicism and Islam are collections of mind viruses which thrive in each other's presence.
No punches pulled. In 2006, he started the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science with the mission to promote science literacy and reduce the stigma around atheism, which is great. We can all use more education and tolerance. Unfortunately, nobody's perfect, and Richard went on to exhibit a bit of uneducated and intolerant behavior himself. Let's talk about a couple of those incidents. In 2011, there was the Elevatorgate scandal, which started off as a tiny thing that happened at a tiny atheist conference. Rebecca Watson, aka Skepchick, was riding an elevator at night where she was kind of propositioned by another participant and she kind of didn't like it. She mentioned the incident on her vlog afterwards, and considering that this blew up into a scandal with its own gate moniker, Looking back at the original source, she was incredibly low-key. She didn't lead with it. It's not even in her video title. Just in between talking about Mythbusters, robot eyes, and jokes, Rebecca just casually mentions the incident, never calls out the guy by name, doesn't try to get him canceled, just says this.
So I walked to the elevator, and a man got on the elevator with me and said, "Don't take this the wrong way, but I find you very interesting, and I would like to talk more. Would you like to come to my hotel room for coffee?" Just a word to the wise here, guys, don't do that.
Pretty reasonable advice, and after explaining why she felt uncomfortable, she moved on to other topics. That was it. So how did something this minor blow up into a gate scandal with 2 Wikipedia entries about it? The answer is Richard Dawkins, who for some reason was so offended that he wrote her a nasty letter in public. This hugely sarcastic letter, in so many words, says Rebecca has no right to complain because women in other countries have it worse than her, which is, if nothing else, a really bad take that doesn't contribute anything useful to the conversation. Worse, he doubled and then tripled down on his comment, and we know that because it's in the Epstein files. No, really. You see, in addition to his other activities, jolly old Jeffrey liked to hang out with famous men including Richard Dawkins and other big-name scientists. Here they all are, taking a joyride on Epstein's jet, the Lolita Express. Now, as far as we know, they were just flying to a science conference nowhere else. Anyway, here's that email from the Epstein files where Dawkins complains about a nasty young woman named Rebecca Watson who seemed to be running some kind of witch hunt against his scientist buddy Lawrence Krauss just because of Krauss's defense of Jeffrey Epstein. And maybe Jeffrey's crimes aren't as bad as they've been painted. Boy, that aged well. Anyway, Elevatorgate blew up into a flame war with battle lines drawn between secular feminists and secular anti-feminists. And whether he wanted to or not, Dawkins became a champion of the anti-feminist side. Now, to give him the maximum benefit of the doubt, I would say that probably not. He didn't want to be a figurehead of anti-feminists. In fact, 3 years later, this is what he said when asked directly about his support of feminism.
Feminism, as I understand it, is the political drive towards the equality of women, so that women should not be discriminated against. Nobody should be discriminated against.
Also around that time, he apologized for his comment, writing, "There should be no rivalry in victimhood, and I'm sorry I once said something similar to American women complaining of harassment, inviting them to contemplate the suffering of Muslim women by comparison." And that was pretty big of him. It would have been bigger if he'd actually apologized to Watson directly or even by name instead of just tossing this one sentence into a blog article that was actually about something else. Incidentally, that something else was him strawmanning people who were criticizing him for yet another insensitive thing he said and refused to apologize for. It's kind of a pattern of his. So let's talk about a more recent incident. That time he tweeted, "Rachel Dolezal, white chapter president of NAACP, was vilified for identifying as black. Some men choose to identify as women, and some women choose to identify as men. You will be vilified if you deny that they literally are what they identify as. Discuss." Well, people certainly did. They discussed how Dawkins was making a false comparison, and in doing so seemed to be going out of his way to disparage trans people. The backlash grew to the point of the American Humanist Association retracting his Humanist of the Year award. Richard was surprised that anyone would think he was siding with anti-trans conservatives here, so to clarify, he went on a talk show with anti-trans conservative Piers Morgan.
You were just espousing a biological fact.
I wasn't even doing that. I was asking people to discuss. Discuss! That's what I've done all my life in universities.
But that's not a classroom discussion question, at least not for any sort of class within Dawkins' academic field.
There are people for whom the word discuss doesn't mean discuss. It means you've taken a position. Which I hadn't.
Yeah, but people aren't dumb enough to actually believe that. His query wasn't phrased in a neutral way. It was written from a particular position. But you don't have to read between lines. Dawkins says so himself in this interview. After claiming to not have one, the very next thing he says is his position.
I had my DNA done, for example.
Yes.
It came back, I had 0 English DNA. I actually had 6% Middle Eastern. So that was a shock to me. I had no idea.
Well, we're all mixed, and therefore it actually is a perfectly reasonable thing for somebody to identify as some particular race if they want to. But sex is not like that.
sex really is binary. And therefore, it's certainly worth discussing that odd anomaly, which I pointed out in that tweet.
I mean, we now have this situation where in women's sport, for example, transgender athletes are beating women by immeasurable distances.
We don't disagree about this.
That's his position. And as others have pointed out, you can't state your position, tack on the word discuss, and then pretend that means you don't have the position that you just stated, which he tried to do in a follow-up tweet. Now, this was all in 2021, so at least back then, he said he didn't want to disparage trans people or ally with Republican bigots, but let's just put a pin in that for now.
Anyway, I thought it was a reasonable thing to discuss.
Okay, let's discuss. Dawkins says sex is a binary biological category, but race is not. And you know what? He's absolutely correct. In fact, race isn't a biological category at all. As Dawkins just said, we all come from a genetic mix. There is no one gene for race. Race is a social category, governed more by social norms than genetics. Sort of like how gender is a social category related to but not the same as biological sex. And Dawkins' Socratic question in his tweet wasn't about biology. It was about the social backlash to Dolezal and comparing it with the social backlash against transphobes. Why, he asks innocently, do people treat race and gender identity differently? Well, because they are different social categories with different rules. Case in point, African American culture is rich and diverse, and there's no one single way to be black. But there is one hard and fast rule. You must have at least one black parent. The backlash against Rachel Dolezal was that she broke that rule. In contrast, gender has no such rule. It doesn't matter who your parents are. That has no bearing on your gender. It's incredible that Richard Dawkins doesn't understand this, but he insists that he doesn't. So, taking him at his word, my introduction to him wraps up like this. Richard Dawkins is an accomplished biologist who knows a great deal about physical science, but surprisingly little about human society. And just for the record, I do not think Dawkins is a bad person or malicious or stupid or anything like that. His books and lectures about science are brilliant and inspirational. He's just human, and one of his flaws is that he repeatedly puts his foot in his mouth when speaking about social issues. And some of his takes are really, really bad. So with introductions out of the way, let's get back to Colin and Richard. They sat down and had a nice chat about everything they have in common. Their love of science, their disbelief in God, and the woke mob coming after them for no good reason.
When I pushed back against creationism and intelligent design when I was in academia, it was nothing but praise by colleagues. But as soon as I started pushing back against their claims about sex being a social construct, or there's maybe 5 sexes, or it's a spectrum, I was basically called a bigot.
Call me skeptical, but people don't usually get called a bigot just for stating a science fact. I've repeatedly said in my videos that sex is technically binary, and I haven't been called a bigot once. So maybe, just maybe, that was in response to something else he said. Why don't we keep watching and find out?
In 2015, there was an article in Nature that came out that is kind of what woke me up to a lot of this. It was called Sex Redefined. And it said that biologists think that sex is much more complex than just male and female. And everything really published in Scientific American now on the topic of sex seems to be completely filled with pseudoscience on this topic.
Look, I'm not here to defend those specific articles or to adjudicate disputes between scientists. But I think that maybe Colin's disagreement with those authors might come down, at least partly, to semantics. How do you define the word sex? Well, Wright and Dawkins are clear about how they define it, and also clear that anyone who defines it differently is wrong, but I have a hunch that it's not so black and white. Let me show you the problem. Here's Wright and Dawkins giving their definition of sex, what it is and what it isn't. And for you visual learners, I'm going to put up this slide, which was made by Colin Wright, and a little arrow to show which part they're talking about.
There are lots of different ways in which sex is determined. In mammals, as you know, it's the XX-XY system. In some reptiles, it's determined by temperature. In some fish, it's determined socially. So there are lots of different ways in which sex is determined. But the definition of the male-female phenomenon is in terms of anisogamy. That's to say, the difference in gamete size, which is ubiquitous throughout the animal and plant kingdoms.
And then you have everything else. You have all the downstream consequences of sex, such as we call this sexual dimorphism. We have differences in height. We have, male deer grow the antlers. They have different hormones going through their bodies. So, and that stuff isn't binary. Their behavior is not binary.
Yes.
Really, the only thing in this whole process that's binary is that middle area of what sexes are.
Okay, got all that? This middle part here is how they define biological sex, and the other two are related but different. This is our sex genotype, and this down here is our sex phenotype. Here's the problem. We don't actually have a word for the whole Neapolitan sandwich. I couldn't find one in the glossary of my biology textbook. I even called up a biology professor friend of mine, and they couldn't think of a word for it either. But maybe it might be useful to be able to call this thing something. Perhaps a word other than just sex, because that would be really confusing. How can sex be a subset of sex? Or, hear me out, we could call the whole thing biological sex, and this middle part could be called, I don't know, gametes, because that's what it is. And that idea, I think, is what Wright and Dawkins are so upset about.
There's been a lot of journals that come out now and talk about animal sex being multimodal. It's kind of rooted in this idea of postmodernism that holds that truth is relative, and then mixed with queer theory, which believes that categorization itself is an inherently oppressive act.
So upset that it's got Colin talking like Jordan Peterson now. Didn't take as long as I thought. But that Petersonian stuff is such a straw man. Calling this multimodal or multifactor isn't postmodernist queer theory. These things are all real, and they do have multiple factors, and Colin knows that because he made this chart. Anyway, having hashed out the definition of sex, they move on to gender.
What you can make a distinction between sex and gender gender is very poorly defined, but it's arguable that there are people who have a sort of psychological dysphoria, it's called, where they feel that they've been born into the wrong body. This is a kind of dualism, that their body may be male, but their soul is female, is sort of lurking inside.
Yes, that poorly defined thing lurking inside us, or as some scientists call it, the brain.
So I have a lot of sympathy with that. What I don't have sympathy with is people who are biologically male, sashaying into female athletic events and carrying off gold medals, which is just cheating.
And this is where Dawkins has completely crossed the line from scientist to just delivering political talking points. A scientist would approach a problem like fairness in sports by analyzing the variables. Do male to female transgender athletes always have an advantage? Well, sometimes they do, I'll give him that. But in other sports, it poses a disadvantage because hormone therapy reduces your muscle mass, but you're still carrying it on a larger frame. And of course, in some sports, it doesn't make any difference at all. So not all sports are the same, and not all transgender people are the same either. It can make a big difference, for example, if the person transitioned before or after puberty, which is all to say that cheating, as Dawkins put it, is an individual problem, not something to pin on an entire group. If a white guy cheats at cards, casinos don't announce, "We have a white male cheater problem," and exclude all white males from casinos, do they? Anyway, this is supposed to be a science lecture, but he keeps going.
I think it's especially pernicious, as I said before, in literally muscling in on athletic events, and also more or less seizing children when they're too young to really know, and kind of indoctrinating them with the view that the sex that they were, quote, assigned at birth is something that is up for debate later on when they really decide for themselves what gender they are. And I think that this is a corruption of childhood, which is wicked.
It's so weird for a scientist to use dogmatic language like corruption and wicked. It reminds me that these anti-gender views he and Colin promote actually have theological roots that can be traced back to the Catholic Church in the 1970s, where women's rights, gay rights, and trans rights were all considered corrupt and wicked because they threatened the authority of the church.
Especially when it actually leads to physical consequences like hormone treatment and surgery, actually removing the breasts of girls who have this internal belief that they've picked up from other people that they really are boys.
Again, Dawkins isn't analyzing data or doing any kind of science here. He's literally just sharing a belief that he's picked up from other people. A belief rooted in religious dogma, by the way. As deeply ironic as that sounds, I guess this is as good a time as any to mention that lifelong atheist Richard Dawkins has recently come out as a cultural Christian.
I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer. But there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian.
Whatever that means, he may not be a religious believer, but he sure seems to believe the fundamentalist-fueled moral panic about trans people. And his media appearances now have drifted into the hyper-political like Piers Morgan, or this channel called Triggernometry, which is like the most culture war-y name I can think of. Just to give you a flavor of the content on Triggernometry, here's one of their top recent videos.
The claim that trans ideology makes and trans activists make is that if I say the words, I am a woman, I am now female.
Is that really what you're saying?
Yes, and I'm there.
But hold on, how do they explain the penis?
It's a female penis. It's a female penis.
Great.
Suck it. That's what they want.
Highbrow stuff. Really just what an esteemed scientist wants to associate himself with.
Suck the female penis.
Now, aside from just being crude, you critical thinkers out there probably noticed another glaring problem with this guy's, reasoning.
That is the claim.
So I may be arguing for the wrong thing.
Right. Also known as a straw man argument. Dude just confidently states this without citing any source.
The trans ideology claim, the trans activist claim, is that self-identification is how you know whether someone is female or male. Self-identification means abracadabra, Stacy.
Abracadabra. Yeah, that's the claim trans activists makes. That's why they all carry magic wands and cast spells. Don't tell J.K. Rowling, she'll be very upset. Point is, this is a complete straw man of self-identification. What self-ID generally means is that if you're not sure how to address another person, they can tell you. And if you're a decent human being, you can respect them and use their pronouns. That's what self-ID usually means. What it does not mean, what no reasonable person would claim, is that me uttering the words, I am a woman, would somehow change my biology and immediately qualify me to play women's sports. That's ridiculous, and that is not how biology or sports or self-ID works. But this dude just spends the rest of the podcast beating the stuffing out of his own made-up straw man.
Having uttered the incantation, I am a woman, I become Stacy.
So why would a respected academic like Dawkins go on a podcast with the female penis dude? You'd have to ask him, but he does. Twice. And yes, dude trots out his trusty line about incantations.
May I jump in?
Yes.
Do you not think that the claim that you can change your sex by means of incantation is a claim?
This, of course, gives Richard the perfect opportunity to correct the straw man fallacy and highlight the importance of making good faith arguments. I'm just kidding.
You're quite right. That's very, very similar to saying that it's an incantation. I am a woman. Therefore, I am a woman. Therefore, everything about me is a woman. You're not allowed to misgender me. You're not allowed to say anything against the idea that I'm a woman.
This is why you shouldn't get involved with culture war ideologues, because if one of their shitty arguments slips past your critical thinking defenses, it can lodge in your brain, as I think we've just witnessed happening in real time. Female penis dude calls it an incantation, which is obvious a new one on Richard. He's a bit surprised, but it fits with his worldview, so he rolls with it. And then a few weeks later on another podcast, we see him repeating his novel idea to fellow scientist Lawrence Krauss. And if that name sounds familiar, yes, that's this Lawrence Krauss, still defending good ideas after all these years.
That's what the transsexual people are effectively saying, that the very act of standing up and announcing, I am a woman, turns you into a woman. So even if you still have a penis.
And that's how culture war crap spreads from host to host. It's like, what would you call it?
Internal belief that they've picked up from other people.
Right, or maybe...
That's a mind virus.
Yes, a virus that we can contact trace from podcast host to host, and even watch it mutate as it spreads, like when Dawkins combines the idea with his critique of religion.
There's a very strong analogy to transubstantiation in transsexualism.
Tell me more. How so?
Yeah, that's my reaction too.
The wine becomes blood
And
when the priest simply declares it that it is. And a male person becomes female when he declares himself to be female. So they really believe that they have become the other sex.
And abracadabra, this straw man has now transformed into a quasi-religion in the mind of Richard Dawkins, a man who has had many brilliant ideas throughout his career, and this is not one of them. So now we get to, I guess, the point of all this. The reason Dawkins is being invited on by so many political and social conservatives is to share his personal opinions about their hot topics, trans people in sports and bathrooms, and for him to use his credentials as a scientist to give weight to those opinions.
There really are two sexes, and scientists have to work under that fact. And if people, for political reasons, are trying to deny that there really is a binary separation between the two sexes, then that is anti-scientific, anti-rational, and is a subversion of language, actually.
Richard, I actually didn't want to make this conversation in any way about the cultural discussions around that issue.
Oh no, female penis man, of course you don't. That's not the entire reason you invited him. But now that you're on the topic...
But since we've come to it, do you sit there and sometimes have to pinch yourself that you, one of the most eminent evolutionary biologists in our society, go on the mainstream media and you are asked to talk about the fact that there's men and women?
Oh, yeah, let's just conflate the gender terms men and women with the biology terms male and female, pretend they're exactly the same, so we can bash trans people. So who's really subverting language here?
Yes, I do have to pinch
And
myself.
where do you think this regression, if you agree with my use of it, where does that come from?
Well, in certain social sciences, they've been very influenced by what they call postmodernism. And I never really understood what postmodernism is. In fact, I think the so-called postmodernists don't know either.
Oh, Richard, not you too. Chalk another one up for Jordan Peterson. And if you don't believe me, Dawkins and Peterson both just worked on the same book. A book edited by, yes, really, Lawrence Krauss. Contact tracing, people. Contact tracing. Anyway, let's hear someone who doesn't know what postmodernism is explain it to us.
But I think it's something to do with words meaning something that is determined by politics, and you don't actually have a fixed meaning of words like male and female, because there's an intellectual movement in the social sciences that says that everything is a social construct, and male and female is a social construct. There's no real validity to to difference between male and female. It's all a social construct.
Okay, to be fair to Richard Dawkins, let me just say that one, I don't know what postmodernism is either, but just for the record, neither does Jordan Peterson. And two, I think he's right to say that male and female are not social constructs. If we're talking about his biology definition, then yes, it is 100% physical reality, 0% social construct. But again, he's conflating two sets of terms, one for gender, the other for sex, and switching between them randomly, which is just so frustrating coming from someone who says this.
Language is useful as something to express your thoughts clearly.
Which sounds great, except that he just said that while on a podcast with Helen Joyce. Yes, the prominent anti-trans activist and leader in the anti-trans movement, that Helen Joyce. And just listen to her describe the people in her movement.
Lots of Brexiteers, lots of anti-vaxxers, lots of evangelical Christians.
That's the alliance that Richard Dawkins is joining up with. Good luck to him, I guess. In this interview, he uncritically nods along at everything Helen says as she explains, for example, that she's not really anti-trans, she's just asking questions.
Just asking very obvious questions, like, don't you think that if we allow people to self-identify their sex, this will lead to, for example, destroying women's sports or putting rapists in women's jails? People would turn this back on me and say, you think that trans people are predators, or you think that trans people are in bad faith, you're a bigot.
That's a willful misunderstanding.
Yes, it is. It is willful misunderstanding.
Yes, it is. Helen is willfully misunderstanding the idea of self-identification, And she's committed the slippery slope fallacy to boot.
If we allow people to self-identify their sex, this will lead to, for example, destroying women's sport.
Respecting people's pronouns is not going to destroy women's sports. That is a very steep and very slippery slope. And Richard Dawkins not noticing such an obvious fallacy when it's staring him in the face, I don't quite know what to make of him anymore. I've tried to be fair. I've tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, but he really seems to have left the scientific community behind at this point for this new tribe of anti-trans allies, a coalition made up of, just to recap, anti-vaxxers, religious fundamentalists, bigots, evolution deniers, grifter podcast bros, and theocratic politicians, especially one particular politician who is, in Dawkins' own words, loathsome.
Under Trump, loathsome as he is, only decent thing he's ever done, I think, is to start in the right direction on this matter of sex differences.
Strange bedfellows indeed. But Dawkins has made his bed, so now he gets to enjoy the company. And hey, since Dawkins doesn't need his Humanist of the Year award anymore, he could give it to Trump. I hear Trump loves receiving secondhand awards. That was a wild ride. I did not expect half of this stuff when I started researching this one. I mean, I knew Dawkins was a controversial figure, but wow, he has taken it to a whole new level now, hasn't he? But thanks for sticking through this with me. You can see the list of amazing patrons scrolling by who make this show possible. And with just a few clicks, your name could be up there too. So, what topic would you like to see me cover next? There is sadly no shortage of crazy stuff out there to debunk, so first, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, then send me your favorite conspiracy theory or grifter or misinformation or whatever you think would be fun to look at. Leave me a comment or send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. See you next time.